Okay, what we want to do today is we want to turn our attention to another topic. What we've been talking about really is microeconomics, the supply and demand and the way markets operate and so forth. What we want to do today is talk about macroeconomics, which is really the branch of economics that examines the overall economy. You know, most of us live in a microeconomic world, and by that I mean our decisions are made in a microeconomic sense. You go to the store, decide to buy something. You get a job, decide to work somewhere. Those are microeconomic decisions. You start a business, that's a microeconomic decision. Most of us live in the microeconomy, me included, but at the same time there's something taking place out there that we don't really perceive, but it affects us in a big way. And it's really sort of like the climate, which is, you can think of as the macroeconomic climate. How are things going, you know, in the overall economy? And there are these major cycles or major trends at work that really affect all of us. And you know, it's not always easy to perceive how we're affected by those trends, but nevertheless we all are. Something may happen like my pay may not go up, and I say, oh, why did my pay go up? And the answer is because the state of Missouri didn't collect much in tax revenue. And the state of Missouri didn't collect the tax revenue to give me the pay raise because maybe there's a recession in the economy. And when people are out of work, they don't pay as much in taxes. And so what I'm saying is that macroeconomic climate, it can affect all of us. You might start up a business and you've got a terrific idea for a business and you just think, boy, now's my chance, I'm going to get rich off of this terrific idea, and you may not make it. And why not? And the answer, it may be that you had a bad idea, but you want to start off with that blue salt idea if you start with something, no? Maybe you didn't have a good idea, but maybe you did have a good idea, and the only problem is you started your business at a time in the business cycle where the macroeconomy was turning down and people are just not going to have a good, you know, go of it at those times. So there's this climate or there's this environmental thing, this macroeconomy thing, and it's a powerful force. It affects you and me and business owners, you know, big millionaires and so forth that own businesses. Everybody's affected the same. Canada's affected by our business cycle. When our economy goes through cycles, it drags Canada along through the same cycle. And Canada's, of course, got millions of people living there. And I mean, these are just major cycles that we're talking about. And yet, we live in the microeconomy. We don't perceive these things much at all. We just, you know, we have a tendency, I think in many cases, to blame ourselves if something goes wrong. You go, oh man, I lost my job, I must be a bum. You know, I don't know what goes through people's mind when they lose a job, but each person's different. But the point is you might be blaming yourself, and it may be due to no cause of your own. And you may also think, oh, I'm just the smartest guy in the world. I started up this business. Everybody's buying blue salt from me, and I'm just getting rich, you know. And I may be congratulating myself, and yet maybe it's not because my idea was so good. It's that I launched my company or my new product at the right time in the business cycle where the economy is headed up. I've used that term a couple times, and let me just kind of indicate what I mean by it. I said business cycle, month and year. We'll put down here in overall economy. How about overall economic conditions? And what I'm saying to you about a business cycle is the economy goes from peaks and then it goes down. It's got sort of bad times, and then it reaches a trough and then it expands again. And so what's happening is we're going through these cycles of up periods and down periods. Here's let me just kind of label these for you. Here's a peak. Here's a contraction, sometimes called a recession. Here's the trough, the bottom. Here's the expansion as the economy is growing, and then we reach a peak. And so from peak to peak, that's one business cycle. Or from trough to trough, if you just pick the same point, then you can go peak to peak or trough to trough, and it doesn't make any difference which. But the point is that the economy goes through these cycles. And by the way, the thing that we also want to realize, well, even though there's cycles, even though we have these downturns, the general trend is up. In the United States, we've had economic expansion over the longer term for as long as this has been a country. Now, that doesn't mean we've not had recessions or contractions, but what I'm saying is that long term, the United States economic story has been one of success and economic growth. And this thing right here is showing us growth, this trend line, and yet we have a cycle around that. By the way, and we'll come back to this later on, but it used to be, and I don't endorse this at all, so don't be taking it that way, but it used to be that people would say, you know, from peak to peak in the business cycle, oh, that's 4 to 5 years, or trough to trough, but the thinking was one business cycle about 4 or 5 years. And there was no particular reason why that had to be 4 to 5 years. It just worked out that way. You know what I'm saying is there's no theory that says, yeah, this has got to be 5 years. Well, what we had in recent years is there was a recession that ended, that is to say we reached a trough in November of 1982. Then the next peak was in 790, July of 1990. That recession ended, so we reached the trough just a few months later, I'm going to say March of 91. And then, since then, there's been no more peaks. And so if you look at, here's one business cycle. This lasted for, what would that be, almost, 8 years? 8 years and some, 8+ years. And since then, it's been more than that. And still counting. And so what I'm saying to you is this whole old deal of, a business cycle about 4 or 5 years, that never had to be that way. And things have gone particularly well for us in recent years. And now we're having these business cycles that seem to stretch out 8, 10 years. And this is a wonderful thing from most people's point of view. That's me using some normative judgment there, saying that I like that. Well, I do like that. But there aren't too many people that don't like it. Nevertheless, what I'm saying is the economy is performing better. Our business cycles seem to be stretching out. We spend more time in these expansion phases, and so there's less unemployment and fewer economic problems. What we want to do, and I've just given you a little bit of it right here, but not very much. What we want to do is to start off talking about the macroeconomy. We want to talk about 3 different concepts today and then again next time. Consumer Price Index is the first. And by the way, sometimes this is called the CPI. Well, we want to talk about these 3 concepts, and the reason for talking about them so much is, today and next time is that we'll be encountering these same ideas over and over, and we really need to be familiar with them if we're going to be talking about them so much. What is a Consumer Price Index? Basically, it's an index number that allows us to trace changes over time in consumer prices. We're tracing over time changes in consumer prices. So if somebody says to you, man, it costs a lot more to live now than it used to, well, that person's probably referred to the Consumer Price Index. And if that Consumer Price Index is going up, there's the conclusion. It costs a lot more to live now than it used to. What we like, and I'm saying desirable, let me write this up here. And again, this is a normative term. You remember that? Concept of normative means we put a value judgment on. Here's something I like or don't like. What we like, most people do, policymakers like, with respect to the CPI, they like price stability. So that is a major macroeconomic target that policymakers have. See if we can keep the price level from rising, the general price level. By the way, this is not every single price. This is an average, really, of prices. And so we could keep price stability in the sense of the CPI not going up and yet some individual prices would rise and other individual prices would fall. And so what we're saying is on a microeconomic level, individual markets, some prices up, some down, but at the macroeconomy, we're saying those offset each other. They sort of balance, and so we don't get an overall increase in the price level. Okay, so anyway, there's our first variable we're going to talk about. A second one, the unemployment rate. We'll talk more about just how that's measured and so forth, what goes into it later on. But the unemployment rate is a second variable we care about. You know, when unemployment goes up, obviously people are out of work, and people don't like that. It's difficult to have a prosperous nation if you have individuals that are not prosperous, individuals within the nation. And so what we try to do, what policymakers consider desirable, is a low unemployment rate. Sometimes this is expressed as a goal of full employment. Full employment, does that mean that every single person's got a job? Well, no, it doesn't mean that. We'll talk about what full employment means when the time comes. And the third one of these macroeconomic variables that we want to talk about is real gross domestic product, which I will abbreviate RGDP. GDP, gross domestic product, and the real, we'll talk about what that means and so forth, but that is an adjective. We're sort of explaining what we mean about this gross domestic product. Desirable, we like for real gross domestic product to grow. We like it to be going up, just as we talked about before when I was talking about the business cycle, and I put this red trend line up here. We like that growth in the real gross domestic product. I could have come over here. If you'll remember, a few minutes ago I wrote overall economic conditions. Real GDP is the term that I could have used for that, overall economic conditions. This is the broadest measure of economic activity. If somebody says, man, the economy is strong, boy, the economy is growing, that sort of thing, what they probably mean is real gross domestic product is going up. We'll talk about how that's measured and what goes into it and what's excluded from it later on. But these are the three things that we want to talk about, and like I say, they will surface over and over again, so you'll be doing yourself a disservice if you don't learn these things at this point, because that will make the rest of the semester more challenging for you. Let me do a little bit of erasing here, and we'll get started talking about the Consumer Price Index. Consumer Price Index. As I said before, this is an index of prices paid by the typical urban consumer. And I want you to understand here where I say this index. We're not talking about a price like $6. That's for sure not an index number. $6 isn't. That's just a price. Well, we're going to talk about an average or a bunch of prices all sort of put together. And so we'll be talking about something that doesn't have a dollar sign out in front of it. It's just an index number. And what this is equal to is the ratio of consumer spending on a specific basket of goods in the present period relative to a base period. So let's go through and talk about this just a little bit. It's a ratio, so it's the CPI is equal to one thing divided by another thing. It's consumer spending on a basket of goods. Spending on basket in the present period divided by spending on the same basket in the base period. And then we're going to do one more thing, which is we're going to multiply by 100. And I'll talk about that later on. But the real key is this idea right here. This ratio of spending on a basket of goods and services in two different periods, the present period and the base period. Now, we'll get more technical here in a second, but let me just give you a general idea of what I'm talking about. Suppose you could go out and buy this basket of goods and services. I better draw that shopping cart. Hey, that's pretty good. I've been to a store. But you wouldn't know by that. Not an art school, though, apparently. Suppose that you go get this defined basket of goods and services, and today that basket of goods and services cost $80 to purchase. And let's say that when you went out and bought exactly the same basket of goods and services in some base period, some benchmark year that we just want to use for the sake of comparison, then maybe that same basket of goods and services cost, let's say $30. Well, what you can see is that, gosh, that basket of goods and services, that costs more than twice as much as it used to. And that's the information that we're looking for. What we would have here is, it would be, what would this be? 2 point, help me out here, 67? Is that right? Yeah, $80 divided by $30 is 2.60. Hey, that's right, 2.67 times 100 equals 267. I'm counting on you to correct me if my math is wrong. Here's what that says, this 267, or the 2.67, that basically says, gosh, goods and services now are 2 2/3 times as expensive as they were previously in that base period. Not quite 3 times as expensive, but more than twice as expensive. And so if you see this consumer price index is 267, gosh, prices have more than doubled since the base period. If you saw that consumer price index is 400, gosh, prices have quadrupled since that base period. Now, when's the base period? Well, it's 1982 through 84. They've picked 36 months for right now. That'll change in the future. But really, it doesn't make any difference when the base period is. It's only for the purposes of comparison. And so whenever we would decide to make this base year, sometimes it's called a base year rather than the base period. But whenever that base year is, it doesn't really make a difference. It's just a benchmark. We have to pick some point in time and price that basket of goods and services then. And from then on, everything's relative to that. Okay? So the next year, maybe this price of goods, of the basket of goods and services is $90. That's next year. And so now the CPI, the consumer price index, will be 300. And you get the idea. We're just comparing, again, what happens to the price from that base period. Okay. Questions about this? Be sure you stop me if you do have a question. Well, just what I didn't want, I looked at my notes and it told me to make up a hard problem and work it for you, and so this is my opportunity to make a mistake. Suppose that, the people who calculate the consumer price index, let's say that they've got 4 different goods in this basket. And that's all we're talking about is what's in the consumer's basket. 4 different goods. We'll say that the goods are A, B, C, and D. Oh, we've been calling them X and Y, haven't we, up to now? But now the goods are A, B, C, D. And let's suppose that in the basket we've got these quantities. And let's say that there are 2 A's and 3 B's and 2 C's and 4 D's. This is in the basket. In the basket. In the basket of who? A typical urban consumer, urban city. This is the consumer price index. It refers to people living in cities, okay, which is about 80% of the population. More on that later. Price in the base period. Let's pick some numbers here. $2, $1, $4, $3. That's the base period price. Let's pick the price today. Price current. And let's say these prices are 2, 3, 4, 5. Where am I coming up with these numbers? Learn them in grade school. They're just simple numbers. But what we need to do is deal with a situation that, a person might confront in reality other than the A, B, C, D. But the point is we've defined certain goods and the quantities people buy. How much did they cost in that benchmark year, in that base year, and how much do they cost today? And now what we want to do is we want to calculate the cost of that basket. Cost of basket, and I'll put up here in the base year, in the base period, base year. 2 units at $2 a piece is $4. You getting the hang of it? 3 units at $1 a piece is $3. Man, I'm loving this. 2 units at $4 a piece, $8. 4 and 3 is 12. Not 4 and 3. 4 times 3 is 12. So what does this basket cost to buy? $17? That does not include the basket. That's just the contents. Oh, pardon me, and thank you. Yeah, oh, I was just testing to see if you were paying attention. Please pay attention some more. Oh, that's not where that goes. What does it cost to buy this basket now? 2 units times $2 a piece. By now, it's currently, I better write myself a cost, basket. That basket, 2 units times $2 a piece is $4. Good B, 3 units, $3 a piece is $9. Good C, we're buying 2 units in the basket times $4 a piece is $8. 4 times 5 is 20. Is it 41 now? Let me get the calculator out. CPI equals the price of the basket in the current year, 41, divided by the price of the basket in the base year, 27, times 100, equals 41 divided by 27 is 1.5185 times 100 equals 151.9. Anybody get a different answer? Be sure and tell me if you did. Here's what this tells me. Prices are about half again as much as they were to begin with. Not all prices. Some prices, let's see, price 2 to 2, there was no change in that price. Here that price tripled. Here's one that didn't change. Here's one that went up by 60%. But the average, and it's a weighted average, we're weighting each one of these prices by how much do consumers buy. But this weighted average is telling us that the average price went up by about a little over 50%, but about 52%. Questions about this? I would expect on test day that you would be given a bunch of numbers like everything above my arm here, and then you'd be told, hey, calculate the consumer price index for me. And then you'd have to know, well, I don't think you'd be given these numbers right here that I've written in black, because that'd be your responsibility. So you'd be given these numbers that are in red. How's that? Above my arm. And then I won't always have my arm there, though, so you should learn this some other way. And then you'd be responsible for figuring out how to go ahead and calculate the cost of this basket, divide the one by the other, multiply by 100. Why do we multiply by 100? And the answer is because the way the consumer price index is stated, we don't leave it as the 1.51. We want it to read 151. Not we, me, but I mean the Labor Department that calculates this. And that being the case, we multiply by 100. Now, since we've multiplied by 100, later on when we use a consumer price index, sometimes we have to divide by 100 to get that out of there. But nevertheless, we won't worry about that right now. That's the only role that the 100 plays, though, is to get these numbers from being 2.67 and make them 267. If the price level had not changed, that is to say, we bought this basket in the base year, and then we come back in another year, and it still cost $27, then the consumer price index would be 100. Right? Any questions about this? Pretty straightforward stuff, I think.
You said it was 50%.
I said that the price level went up. It's a little more than 50% higher than it was to begin with. 52% is closer. 51.9% is exact. No? You agree with it? Okay. If you don't agree, be sure and tell me. I could be wrong. Here's another way of interpreting this. Goods and services that cost $100 in the base year, now cost $151.90. And that's kind of a way that a lot of people think of this in these terms. There's different ways you can interpret it, but $100 worth of goods and services in the base year now would cost you $151.90. We weren't buying $100 worth, we were buying $27.41. But if you were buying $100 worth, now the cost of that $100 worth of goods and services would have gone up by almost 52%. Any questions about this? Okay, let's just go through and talk a little bit about the CPI, where it comes from, who calculates it, and so forth. One. Where does it come from? And the answer is Washington, D.C. calculates, not the whole town, but people in Washington, D.C. calculate the consumer price index. There's an office called the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS. They calculate the consumer price index. Now, why do they do that? And the answer is the Labor Department was originally started, and then within the Labor Department, the Bureau of Labor Statistics was started in order to basically provide services to workers. And I don't mean to say individual workers, but in that broad category of workers. And one thing that workers need to know is they need to know, hey, are the costs of living going up? If it's costing more to live now than it used to, I'd like to have a raise to keep up with the cost of living. And so as a service to workers, union workers and non-unionized workers, but as a service to the workers, then the government calculates this cost of living, provides that information to everybody in the economy, and then when workers are bargaining for wages, they can take this into account. Oh, the cost of living has risen 10% since last year, and so I think you ought to give me a raise of 10%. That sort of an idea. As I say, this is a bureau within the Labor Department, U.S. Department of Labor, and the U.S. Department of Labor is one of those cabinet-level departments of the government. They've got offices scattered around the United States in addition to Washington, D.C., but they have like offices in Kansas City and St. Louis, not here in Springfield. Okay. This is calculated monthly. By this, I mean the Consumer Price Index is calculated monthly, and it has been for many, many years. Not forever, but for a long time. And in fact, before the Consumer Price Index was calculated, there were some numbers collected, and so now economists with the Bureau of Labor Statistics have gone back and calculated a sort of a CPI going back into the 1800s or early 1900s, I'm not sure which. I wonder if I've got anything here it tells me. 1913 is the first year I have. But I think they've done some work going back into the 1800s, estimating what the CPI would have been even previously. Oh, and you want to know how much the CPI was in 1913? In January 1913, it was 9.8. And now it's more like 165. So 9.8 to 165, prices are, what would that be, 16, 17 times as high today as they were in 1913. What do we have here? The prices, let's see how I want to say this. Thousands of prices, there we go, are sampled. That is to say, the market basket doesn't have thousands of goods and services in it. It's got dozens of goods and services. But then the Bureau of Labor Statistics people, they go out, let's say that a box of, well, let's take Cheetos. You know those little yellow cheese things that you eat them and they make your lips all yellow and all that stuff? I love those things. Anyway, let's say that those are in the consumer basket. I'm teaching the class, so we're putting Cheetos in the basket. So anyway, let's just suppose that that Cheetos are in that basket. They'll go out and price those Cheetos in several different stores and in different cities and so forth. So thousands of particular prices are sampled every single month. And I'm saying not just 1,000 or 2,000 either, but like 10, 12,000. Okay. This basket is for the typical urban household. That is to say, the goods and services in that basket, like the Cheetos that everybody likes to eat, those things are the goods and services purchased by the typical urban household. And this is about 80% of families. Probably including your family and my family. And that doesn't mean they survey us. They go to the stores and do the surveying. But the point is that these are things to find out what goes into that basket. Every once in a while, the Labor Department goes out and surveys that urban household and says, hey, you know, how many Cheetos are you buying? And people are saying, oh, man, I don't know. I eat a bag of them every day, I think. So anyway, the idea, though, is they survey that urban household, decide what's in the basket, and then go out every month and find out basically what does it cost to buy the goods and services in that basket. What do they survey? Something like between 50 and 60,000 families, though, that they survey in order to find out what people consume. This base year, base period, I'll say, usually it's called the base year, is 1982 through 84, which is 36 months. So what happened is over that 3-year period, 82, 83, 84, the Labor Department went out, found out the cost of purchasing the goods and services in this basket, and then averaged those 36 observations, those 36 months, and that's what goes in the denominator for the base year, is the average over those 36 months. And so now, if somebody tells you that the Consumer Price Index is, I don't know, 200, then what they mean is prices now are twice as high as they were in that 36-month period, that base period. there's a bias in the CPI. I think it's biased against me, but the bias is it overstates inflation. It makes inflation seem worse than it really is. Now, why does it do that? And the answer is there are several reasons that it does it. Let me just mention a couple. But what happens over time is this. Products improve. You know, if you go back to the 1960s or 70s and find the very finest car that you could locate then, and then you set it here and you go out and find the finest car you can buy today and set it right next to it and you look at them, and there's a big difference in those cars. The newer car's got a smoother ride, the newer car is safer, the newer car is quieter, the newer car's got a better stereo, the newer car needs tuned up once every 100,000 miles rather than once every 12,000 miles. There's a huge difference between these cars. And so, since there's product improvement, if we say that the price of a good's gone up, oh, look, that car now costs $30,000, used to be it only cost $10,000, then what we're not recognizing is part of the reason for that increase from the $10,000 it used to be for that car back 30 years ago, 40 years ago, to what it costs now for that car. Part of the increase in the price is not due to the fact that they're raising the price of the car, but due to the fact that they're improving the car. It's got airbags on it. It's got front airbags. It's got side airbags. What's next? Airbags for rollovers, you know, up in the ceiling. But anyway, product improvement, the Labor Department, Bureau of Labor Statistics, they try to account for that, but don't always do the best job of it, and so there's still a little bit of bias in there. There's another bias regarding the places where people shop. What's happening over time in our economy is this. We're developing more and more efficient ways of retailing merchandise. Used to be, when, and I'm saying used to be 50, 60 years ago, you'd buy your groceries at the mom and pop's grocery store in your neighborhood. And then what happens is mom and pop got surpassed by supermarkets. Sears, A&P, and a few of these other supermarket chains, and they would be, 10,000 square feet, 15,000 square feet, and the aisles would be there, and they'd have the refrigerated places where they would keep the, vegetables and meats and things like that. And then the next thing, and it just kept on improving. And then Walmart gets into the business and got the super centers with huge grocery store operations. I don't know what's next. Everything's going to the internet, so maybe we'll be buying groceries off of the internet. Yeah, send me over a pound of bacon. I don't know how it would get to me, but anyway, the point is that over time, we're shopping at different places. And if we are shopping at different, and why do we shop at different places? And the answer is to get a better deal. We don't just say, well, I've been shopping at mom and pop's for years. I'm just sick and tired of that. I think I'd rather go to a supermarket. That's not how it works. There's mom and pops. Everybody's happy going to mom and pops. There's a supermarket. And then people start saying, gosh, the supermarket's a little cheaper than mom and pops. Well, if we were pricing these goods, the ones that are in the basket, if we were pricing those to begin with down at mom and pops, and we keep on pricing every single month, go to mom and pops and ask how much for a bag of Cheetos. But in reality, people aren't shopping at mom and pops anymore. They're going over to the supermarket or the super center or the internet and the grocery store or whatever. Then what that means is people are getting a better deal than what you would think by just looking at the mom and pops approach. So that's taken place. There are other things that we could talk about here. I won't spend a lot of time talking about it, but I'll just say that there are things like this where we are changing our behavior, and it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it's their job to keep up with what we're doing. What are we buying? Where are we buying it? What's being produced? Is it a better product or whatever? And I'm saying to you that they don't do the best job of keeping up with this. They probably do a better job than I could, but I'm just saying this is not perfect. let me mention to you that if you look back, there was something called the Boskin Commission. Let me write this down, Boskin Commission, that studied this problem back in 1996. I think in December they released their report. And here's what the commission said. They said, looking back, we think that the CPI overstates inflation by about 1.3% per year. Looking back, they thought, the Boskin Commission, and by the way, this is named after a guy named Michael Boskin, who is a leading economist. They said, we think that the CPI overstates inflation by about 1.3% a year. That's looking back. Looking forward, we think it's continuing to overstate inflation by about 1% a year, 1.1% a year. Since that commission did its report, then the Bureau of Labor Statistics has done some new things, some different things, and has gotten rid of about half of this problem. That is to say, probably right now the CPI is about a half or 0.6% overstating inflation right now. Final point I'll make today. The Consumer Price Index, let me write that down here, is not the cost of living People will say something like, oh, look, the Consumer Price Index went up, the cost of living rose. That's probably right. But strictly speaking, there are costs of living that are not included in that basket. So strictly speaking, that is not the cost of living. It's the cost of that basket and how it changes over time. That's all for today. We'll pick up with this next time and go on and talk about those other topics. So long. Hi, I wanted to just talk a few minutes after class about something that's related to what we've been talking about, but slightly different. We've been talking about the CPI and the price level for the economy. What let's talk about for a few minutes is the inflation rate. Inflation refers to a rise in the Consumer Price Index. And so what we're talking, a Consumer Price Index, or the GDP deflator, but what we're talking about then with inflation is an ongoing increase in the price level. Let me show you this chart right here that shows the Consumer Price Index from 1913 up until, just gets us up through 1999, but this is pretty representative. What you'll see here is that from the chart, the graph of the Consumer Price Index looks fairly stable up until about 1950, and then you see it start to rise gradually, and then after that you see that the rise is greater. Well, anyway, as soon as we see that Consumer Price Index going up, we would refer to the inflation, and the inflation rate is a percentage change in the price level. What you can see in this chart is that, as I say, up until the late 1940s, the price level was approximately constant, but the price level did go up at the time of World War II, stabilized after that, and then the price level rose very slowly, 1 or 2% a year, until about 1966, and then that curve starts getting steeper and steeper, and then you can see in the last couple decades that the Consumer Price Index has gone up quite a bit. With the CPI as 100 in the base period of 1982 through 84, we can see that the price level went up from about 10 in 1913 until now it's up at about the 165, 170 mark. And so prices are about 17 times as high in 1999 as they had been in 1913. So anyway, the Consumer Price Index is a level of prices, and when that Consumer Price Index goes up, we say there's inflation. And so now what we want to do is we want to distinguish, when we're talking about inflation, we want to distinguish between the overall price level, like the Consumer Price Index, versus the prices of specific products. If the price of gasoline goes up, we don't say that's inflation, or the price of shoes goes up, that's not inflation. Inflation occurs when the price of shoes and gasoline and most all goods are going up in price. And so it's an overall increase in the price level. As we saw in that chart a moment ago, the United States experienced the greatest inflation from really 1966 through 1982. Just as in the 1930s we would refer to the Great Depression, this was really the great inflation for the United States from 1966 through 1982. What are the effects of inflation? Well, for one thing is, of course, it costs more when you go to the store or when you go to the department store, someplace to buy something. It's more expensive. So we recognize that. On the other hand, that's the obvious effect of rising prices. You have to pay a higher price. The less obvious effect is that people don't sit back and just say, oh, I hate that, I have to pay higher prices. What they do then, if they're workers, is they go to work and they say to the boss, hey, I think I need a pricing or a wage increase. And if they don't go to the boss and say it, then what will happen is maybe their union says it. We want to bargain for higher wages for our workers. In addition to that, other owners of the factors of production do the same thing. People who are lending out funds, lenders, they will say, oh, there's inflation. I want to add on to the interest rate that I charge for the use of the funds, because if I hand you dollars today and then you hand them back a year from now, when you give those dollars back a year from now, they're not as valuable as they were a year previously due to rising prices. And so the people who do the lending, they would like to have an inflation premium tacked onto the interest rate they charge. The rents will go up on the house you rent, and so forth. So the point is that these higher, the higher inflation rate gets built into factor prices. And these are just compensating the worker or the lender for the inflation they're having to live with. They don't really get that person ahead of the game. It's just compensation to keep them constant in real terms or inflation-adjusted terms. Another effect of inflation is it causes people to start making different investments in order to sort of make a profit on inflation. What we've noticed by looking at the past is this: when we have inflation, prices are going up. Certain things like land values, gold, silver, diamonds, artwork, things like that tend to go up in price even faster than the overall price level. So what people do is, if they see inflation coming along, they say, oh, I think I'm going to buy some farmland. And then that farmland, if there's a 10% inflation rate, this farmland will go up 15% in value. And so I'm going to make a profit. So one of the effects of inflation is it sort of skews or distorts investment within the economy. And people make a lot of investments that aren't really useful, investments that they wouldn't make if there were no inflation, but they're just trying to sort of play that game. Who gets harmed by inflation? Well, if you go back to some of the things I've said here in the last couple minutes, if I have to pay 5% more to buy groceries, but at the same time I've bargained for a 5% wage increase, I haven't really been hurt by inflation very much. My costs go up 5%, I have 5% more money to spend, I've sort of broken even. The people who get harmed by inflation are people living on fixed incomes. If, let's say you were on a pension, and that pension paid you $1,000 a month every single month, but the prices of the goods you pay goes up, 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 there's a certain point where you won't be able to buy those goods and services that you need to support yourself. And so people living on fixed incomes are really the ones in the worst situation as a result of inflation. Those tend to be elderly people, and it also tends to be people on relatively low incomes. So people at sort of those two extremes are the ones who are hurt most by inflation. Most people with sort of careers and so forth are not hurt very much by inflation. They're inconvenienced by it and annoyed by it, but their incomes go up to match the higher prices of goods. Since 1981, we had our big inflation in the 1960s and 70s. So from 1981 on, the United States, the Congress, the President, the Federal Reserve, they all pretty much agreed that inflation was a very harmful, had very harmful effects on the U.S. economy back in the 60s and 70s. And so since 1981, it's been a major policy goal to stabilize the price level, or to at least bring the inflation rate down to where it's negligible, 1 or 2%. And the Federal Reserve, we'll talk about later on in the course, but the Federal Reserve has the power to get rid of inflation. And that's what we've seen really since the mid-1980s, is inflation coming down to where it's not a very big problem anymore. We'll talk later.